Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell and I'm happy you're with us today. If you didn't listen to last week's episode on how to use our know, like, and trust storytelling flywheel as a strategy tool to create powerful story marketing, then please take a listen to that special 450th anniversary episode of our show. The storytelling flywheel can also be used to organize your data storytelling. We have an expert for you today who will help you turn your data into drama to take the numb out of your numbers and create the business impact you seek. Have you ever found yourself lost in space? And by space, I mean that vacuous void between data either you are trying to communicate or someone else is laying on you. The problem is when we don't use stories to create context for our numbers, we confuse the mind with what I call the malaise of metrics. Today's guest will show you how to use storytelling to make your numbers make sense.
Business metrics can be served up to certain audiences. They already understand the context, so they already understand enough about the data and the topic that's being communicated through those dashboards. They don't need to have a story. Whereas in other situations, you might say the ECG example, because you're not a doctor, because you don't have that background to understand those data metrics, you might then turn to the doctor and say, hey, tell me what's going on. And the doctor then has to interpret all of those different medical metrics and explain them to you in a way that you will understand. And so that's data storytelling as an example in that medical context.
Kat Greenbrook is a data storyteller from New Zealand and author of the new book, The Data Storytellers Handbook, How to Create Business Impact Using Data Storytelling. She is a consultant, workshop facilitator, industry speaker, and founder of the data storytelling company Rogue Penguin. You will hear later in the show where that name came from. With a unique blend of science, business, and design, she empowers data professionals to communicate data effectively through, you guessed it, storytelling. We'll be exploring data storytelling as one of the ways businesses can communicate their insights. But the problem is that people usually involved in data storytelling aren't your stereotypical storytellers. You'll learn why data storytelling isn't technical. Much of it is understanding the business goal one is trying to achieve and the audience they are attempting to influence. And why data storytelling isn't data visualization either. These two terms are used interchangeably a lot, but they are not synonymous. Much of this misunderstanding stems from the pathway people usually take into data storytelling. So please welcome to the Business of Story, Kat Greenbrook. Kat, good morning and welcome to the show. I guess it's morning here, but it's like tomorrow there.
Yeah, it is tomorrow morning though.
It is tomorrow. Where are you coming to us from?
I am in Wellington in New Zealand.
So great to have you here. My wife Michelle and I had a chance to visit your beautiful, beautiful country pre-COVID in March of 2019 and just absolutely loved it.
Yeah, 2019, wow, that seems like a whole other world ago.
Yeah, it sure seems like that. Now, judging by your accent, I take it you grew up there?
I did, yes. I was born in New Zealand. My dad was born in New Zealand, but my mum was born in the UK. So she was an immigrant to New Zealand, but yes. Both myself and my brothers are all born in New Zealand.
I got you. And you have made an exciting career out of data storytelling, or is it data storytelling? I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it.
Yeah, it totally depends on who you ask. So I used to say data. And then when I moved to the UK, I did some work over there for a couple of years, and I just got completely hassled for using the word data. And because over there, it's always data. And I kind of got the word data beaten out of me. And so now I say data. But I mean, here in New Zealand, people say both.
We can go either way. Okay, so I have heard a lot of different definitions of data storytelling and what it means. What is your definition of it?
Yes, there are lots of definitions of it. And I think it's because it's such a new field, it's a new term. People are still trying to figure out exactly what it is. So my definition of data storytelling is communicating a data-derived message through narrative. And you can use visuals to support those narratives, but for me, data storytelling is about how do you communicate that message, and it can be, as I say, with or without visuals.
Can you give us an example of a story that is used to create context around data or data driving that story?
Yeah, so my background is analytics, and so I come from an analytics world where there is data everywhere. There are data metrics everywhere, and people in those roles, a lot of the time they're told, oh, just look at all this data and try and make sense of it, try and tell a story with it. And it can be really hard for people in those roles to do, especially when you've got a whole lot of different data metrics looking at you, and there are multiple stories within those data metrics that can be told. And so the trick is to figure out which data metrics are interesting, which are going to tell an interesting story, and then just pull one of those stories out of it. And a lot of the time you're trying to do this because you've maybe done some analysis and you need to communicate the results of that analysis to people who are sitting outside of a data team, so they may not necessarily understand all the technical skills and techniques that go into actually creating those insights. And you have to communicate the meaning of what you found to people without that data knowledge. And so for people in those roles, data storytelling is really important because it's a way that they communicate their value to the rest of the organization. And it's a way that their work is able to flow through to the operational or the strategy side of organizations to really create that business impact. So for people in those roles, communicating data is incredibly important, and data storytelling is one of the ways in which you can do that.
All right, can you show it to us in action? Can you take us to a moment? Maybe you were sitting in the room, or maybe it was the young Kat and you hadn't really bought into storytelling quite yet, and someone was trying to communicate a data, we'll just call it a message at this point because they weren't using storytelling. Can you take us to that moment and what happened? And maybe it was an aha to you that said, you know what, these numbers are going nowhere. We got to figure out a better way to communicate this stuff.
Yes, I have a couple of those moments from being very, very green in the analytics field. And for like many people who enter that analytics world, you come at it through a very, very technical lens, and you want to show your value by showing how technical you are and how amazing your technical abilities and skills are. And I definitely fell into that boat. And so in one of my earlier roles, I did have to communicate some of the work that I was doing to an audience. They were actually the marketing team. And I was working on a dashboard at the time, so I was doing a lot of dashboard building, and they wanted to have an idea of what I was working on, so they wanted me to show off what I'd done. And me being the very, very technical analyst I was at the time in that mindset, I thought, great, I'm going to show them all of the functionality of the dashboard, and they're just going to be wowed by what this amazing software is capable of. And I remember doing the presentation and just watching almost one by one, just the eyes closing, the people starting to nod away and looking at their phones, and I just remember feeling absolutely just, your heart drops and you're like, oh, this is not going well. And this is well before I realized that I have to start thinking about who my audience is. What am I trying to tell? What do they care about? What are their motivations? So very, very green to the industry. And I just remember thinking, well, what's the point? These people don't care about the work that I'm doing. Why am I even doing it? And it did take a little bit of time for me to realize that not necessarily everybody does care about how you do analytics. They care about what you find. They care about what it means to them. And it's changing that mindset from being very, very technically focused. I mean, you still need to have technical skills to work in analytics. Those skills are still very, very important. But you don't necessarily have to show off those skills or explain those skills to people outside of the team. Different motivations, different needs, different ways of contributing to a business. And that was the key for me in understanding that concept.
So when you left the room that day and you thought, man, I completely lost my audience. They don't care what I'm doing. They don't care what it's about. And you realize maybe it was how you delivered it. What was your next step? Did you go in search of an answer on how to communicate this?
I'd love to say it was that easy. I'd love to say, yes, I had this realization and it was great. No, it took a bit of time. It took a couple of years actually working in analytics and being put in those situations. I actually got really fed up. I got sick of, I was building predictive models at the time and just seeing them not really go anywhere. And organizations, we're talking maybe 19 years ago, and organizations back then, they just weren't really at the point where they could operationalize a lot of the output of analytics. We are getting further closer to that point today, but we're still struggling a bit. And that, to somebody who was spending a lot of their time and their job producing these analytical outputs, producing these insights, just to see your work not really do anything and go anywhere, it can be really, really disheartening. So it actually took me thinking, I need a career change. I need to get out of this space. I don't feel like I'm contributing to the businesses that I'm working in. And it was that point that I decided, no, I'm going to go and I'm going to retrain. I want to do something completely different. And so I went and studied digital design with the whole idea of, I'm going to now become a graphic designer. I'm going to completely leave analytics behind. And so that was my plan. It wasn't about realizing that it was a communication issue. It was just like, no, this is not for me. I'm getting out of here. And
so let me backtrack a little bit. So you are. You obviously were very good at your data analytics career in finding the insights, just not so good at sharing them. So you got a little bit frustrated and discouraged and said, gee, they're not listening to me and they're not really following my insights. Therefore, I must not be very good at this. I'm going to go back to school and get completely out of my left brain, analytical, reason, logic-driven brain, and become a designer. Move to the right side.
Yeah. I thought that was the answer. And I did. I was working as an analytics consultant for a bank at the time. So I was building predictive models in my day job, and then I would go and study design in the evenings and the weekends. And I did that for 2 years. And at the end of it, this was around about the time that data visualization got really popular. And I found myself in a position where I had all this data experience, and I'd recently gone and got all skilled up in design. And I was just at the right place at the right time, I think. I'd like to say it was intentional, but it completely wasn't. It was right place, right time. And I really leaned in hard to the data visualization field because I initially thought that data visualization was going to be the answer in engaging people with analytics. I thought if I could make something pretty enough, then they would look at it and then that would add value to organizations. And I really believed that. I thought data viz was the answer. And so much to the point that I started my own company. It was a data visualization company. and with that intent. But what I realized as I got more and more into doing data visualization was that data visualization was not the answer. It would only get you so far. Yes, it was better to have a nice visual than not a nice visual, but data visualization was not the answer to engaging people with creating that business impact and making that data really flow through to actually create value for an organization. And it wasn't until I went to a science communication conference that someone was talking about this ABT, and that was just a random.
Dr. Randy
It
Olson.
wasn't even Randy Olson. It was somebody talking about his work, and yeah, it was a light bulb for me, because I was still struggling to figure out how data visualization could really help organizations engage with analytics. But hearing this narrative structure, and it was something that I'd never come across before, I knew exactly how I was going to implement that in terms of data communication. So it wasn't just science communication that it could help, and because this was the context that I was learning it in, but I knew how it would very, very easily go across and relate to businesses, and people in these very data heavy roles could use this, could apply this structure, this narrative structure, in terms of how they communicate information. And ever since then, I haven't looked back. I am just all about the power of story in terms of how you communicate this technical information.
Isn't it interesting, though, how the universe works? And I know people think this is woo-woo, but I'm a big believer in it. So here you are, you're in a data analytic career, and it sounded like you really enjoyed it, but then you realized that your progress was blunted by the lack of ability to communicate the insights and the findings that you were being able to sort through and arrive at. So then you go back to school, you study art. Now you've got the power of both that left and right brain. And I know it's not really left and really right, logic and reason, but now you've got emotion and logic working together. And then you go to a science conference and you hear about the and but therefore, the ABT that Dr. Randy Olson has perfected throughout the science world. And here you are today with your own book, the Data Storytellers Handbook, that brings that intersection, right, together of data analytics, and design and storytelling. I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and I do. I love data, and I love analytics, and I love what you can do with it. But I think a lot of the time what is produced in data analytics is completely wasted. Because it's not communicated well to the people that will be able to actually create impact from it. And there's so much potential in just communicating your information in a way that other people can understand it when you're working in this space.
Okay, so let's dive in. From your book, which is beautifully written, and it's really fun how you illustrated it. I mean, you can definitely see your data illustrations come together to make your points. Let's walk through some major highlights of the book. Like if someone is listening to this for the first time, let's take them through the first 3 things they should really consider when they are trying to become a more powerful data storyteller.
Yes. Okay. So I have a process that I use in my data storytelling. I mean, this is my process. You will see different processes out there by different people, and that's fine. Because as I said earlier, it is a field that is constantly being evolved. So my process involves a couple of steps. First step is actually figuring out why you're communicating in the first place. And this, I think, is something that we don't do often enough in terms of data communication. A lot of the time we make numbers accessible to our stakeholders. We might put them in a dashboard and, they're up, they're available. But we don't really know why and what people are going to do with it. So understanding, first of all, why you're communicating when you're doing data storytelling, what do you want your audience to do or to understand, is a really good first step, because it will drive how you put together whatever it is your communication looks like. The next step, when you figured out your why, is to understand who you're communicating with. Who is your audience? a lot of the time we think we know enough about this in terms of, oh yeah, I'm communicating to the marketing manager and that's enough. And maybe it is in some cases. Maybe you know the marketing manager inside out and you understand what motivates them, but having a little bit of a think about what are their goals, what are their motivations, how can you actually weave into the work that they're doing, the problems that they're having, and figure out how what you put together in your data storytelling will resonate with that particular audience group. That's also the second step in terms of the why and then the who. The third step is the what, and this is what gets people, I think, confused about the most in terms of data storytelling, because this is where you figure out what is your message, what is your narrative. And for people in data roles, this is not necessarily something that they understand too much about. So people listening to your podcast will be very familiar with the ABT and that kind of narrative structure. But for people in data roles, they haven't necessarily ever come across any kind of narrative structure or be familiar with how to put together any sort of narrative or story. And so having a little bit of a framework around that, I think, is really important. As I said before, a lot of the time people in these roles have a lot of data metrics and they just have to pull out a story from that. And so I do have in that book, there is a bit of a canvas to help people go from a whole lot of data metrics to figuring out what are the important informational building blocks I need to put into a narrative structure, because it makes that process a little bit easier. And then the very, very last step, when you figure out your why, your who, and your story, or your what, is to tell that story. And this is generally the step that people go to first, because this love of data visualization, this is where that comes into it. And so I think data visuals are very, very easy to create when you understand the message that you're trying to communicate. Whereas some of the times people in data roles, they'll go straight to I want to design a data visualization because it's fun, because I get to play with the software, without really truly understanding why they're designing it, who they're designing it for, or what it is that they're trying to say with their communication. And so it's about just flipping the script a little bit in terms of the process that people follow, going through some of those more strategic decisions before you get to your more creative and visual fun.
Where and when have you seen an amazing data storyteller in action? And how did they do it?
I work with quite a few data science teams, and just in a mentoring capacity. And so I do get to watch a lot of people in these roles experiment with different ways of storytelling. And so what I work with them on, some of the time they'll have to present what they're working on to a wider audience, so people outside of their team. Some teams I work with have a quarterly meeting that everyone in the data science team has to produce one slide, and they have to use that one slide to tell the wider business about the work that they're doing, about the technical work that they're doing. And some people are better at this than others, but I see the people who are very, very successful in doing this are generally the ones that can get very, very clear on what impact their work is going to have to that organization. The ones that struggle a little bit with this kind of activity are the ones who get very, very detailed on how they've done it. So they go into detail about the software they're using and the algorithms that they've created, whereas the audience, the end user, is not particularly interested in that kind of thing. So having that kind of view on different ways of doing it can be quite helpful, and people learn a lot from looking at how other people do it. So the ones that I've seen really, really successful are the ones that don't include a lot of visuals. They rely on that narrative to really drive the conversation, what's going to happen next. And it's a real struggle to get people to leave the visuals behind when they're almost a crux for people in these roles.
All right, Kat, I'm going to keep pushing on you. Maybe it's an American way, because I'm doing some work in London with some folks, and I keep pushing for their stories. So you've just shared with us the general overview. I want you to take us to a moment when you saw somebody deliver an amazing data story. Tell us what happened and how did the audience react to it, that moment in time.
The story, the data story that always sticks in my head is one that I think is a really good example of data storytelling is done by David Attenborough. It was a video that I watched. It was just online, but I think data storytelling can play out in all over the place, and sometimes we don't even know that you're witnessing it. Whereas if you watch anything like that, for me, watching this David Attenborough storytelling, he included data metrics in what he was using. He included visuals in what he was using, like data visuals. The thing with data storytelling is that there is not necessarily one moment, or I mean, if you think about it in terms of a communication, you communicate every single day. Every single day there is some sort of business communication going on, and so therefore there is some sort of data communication going on. And to say that one moment really stands out in just a general business setting, it can be quite hard to just pinpoint. So I think, I mean, you go for the famous ones. You go for David Attenborough. You go for Hans Rosling. He was another amazing data storyteller. But those moments...
What did he do? I'm not familiar with him.
Hans Rosling. So there's lots of videos about him online. He wrote the book called Factfulness. Before he died, he was all about trying to make data metrics as impactful as possible, and he did this in the way that he communicated the information. So he was quite, if you're interested in learning more about data storytelling, he was a very good person to try and emulate. But yeah, data storytelling for me, it's those small moments. It's those moments where you have a conversation around a water cooler, and that can lead to something else, some sort of action, and that action might be really, really small. It could be something like reading a report that someone's recommended based on the story that they told around what's in the report. It doesn't have to be those big, amazing moments that create impact. It can be those really small communications that we don't even think twice about. So it's hard for me to just say this is an amazing moment.
To land on one.
Yeah, whereas I think it is all those little things that come together, and we don't really realize. I mean, you've got the moments where you can use data storytelling to influence in terms of creating business cases. I've seen a lot of business cases that come together with data storytelling as a way of influencing that particular business case. But most of the times when you use data storytelling, it's kind of boring in terms of they're not going to be these milestone moments.
When someone is rolling out their data, they typically, the way I think about it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is they're going to show up with their 20-slide deck, and everything's going to have a number after a number, and then a chart and a graph and more numbers and whatever, without really giving it the context of a story. What does this mean? And an example I use in the simplest of simplest data storytelling, at least that I believe in, is simply look at the weather app on your iPhone. So that's a data story in action. You don't even need to have anyone presenting it to you. You look at it, you've got the numbers there. Like today I'm in northern Arizona. We had an incredible snowstorm blow through this morning, and then it's warmed up, so we'll have drizzle, and then we'll have some more snow tonight. If I go, and I'm on there all the time because I've got to drive and move around here, I look at that data story that app is giving me, and it's giving me the numbers, it's giving me the humidity, precipitation, chances of things happening. It's numbers, and then they add a little visual storytelling with a snowflake or a cloud or the wind blowing or whatever. But then our brains automatically turn that into context, right? Because those numbers really mean nothing to us unless we place it in the context. In this case, the context would be, gee, I better walk my dog Hazel earlier than later, otherwise we're going to get dumped on. Or, gee, I better throw my long underwear on if I'm heading into Flagstaff because I don't want to freeze to death if I were to break down alongside the road. So we are taking that data story and we are creating the story in our own mind, right? We're picturing that. The same is true if you go to a hospital and you've got a loved one who's in the emergency ward and they allow you to come in and see them after an accident. you don't go to their EKG. They're all plugged in, and there you've got the data telling how healthy they are, what their vital signs are, whatever. No, you first go to the context of how are they doing, looking them in the eye. If they're awake, you talk to them, you hold their hand, you ask how are they doing. So you immediately jump over to the context of a story. You don't embrace the EKG, you embrace the human being. In the corporate world, and a good example I would think would be early on when Steve Jobs and Bill Gates were going head-to-head with Apple and Microsoft. Whenever you heard Bill Gates talk, it was boring, logic, reason-driven, massive amounts of data being thrown at you, and you, they presume, would just arrive at what the answer was, where Jobs turned that on its ear. He says, no, we've got the data to back all this up, but let me tell you about the insights and the outcomes and the real world impact that these numbers and this science, this computer technology is actually creating. So in my mind, if I understand you right with data storytelling, it's look at you are armed with the temperature and the precipitation and the chance of wind and this wind speed, but it's your job to now communicate that as a story so that a Homo sapien sitting across from you can make sense of that data through the context of a story.
Yeah, and the weather app is a great example because in some cases in a business context, you don't need data storytelling. And so in the weather app example, you're looking at the weather and you're creating that context for yourself. So all they're doing is
Correct.
Serving up those metrics to you, serving up those whatever they are. And because of what you already understand, you are making those decisions for yourself. And the same is true in business. And so this is why we have dashboards. So business metrics can be served up to certain audiences. They already understand the context. So they already understand enough about the data and the topic that's being communicated through those dashboards. They don't need to have a story. Whereas in other situations, you might say the ECG example, because you're not a doctor, because you don't have that background to understand those data metrics, you might then turn to the doctor and say, hey, tell me what's going on. And the doctor then has to interpret all of those different medical metrics and explain them to you in a way that you will understand. And so that's data storytelling as an example in that medical context. So you're turning to an expert to try and relay that information in a way that you can then do something with it. Because for most people, reading all those ECG outputs and whatever other machines are going on in that hospital room, they're not going to understand that. It is a completely foreign language in some cases. And so that's the interpretation role that data storytelling can play. And if you put that into a business context, there's lots of data metrics being produced in a business, and lots of teams have different understandings about those metrics. So for some teams communicating to people, they will understand it and a dashboard will be fine. Whereas others, you do need that data storytelling, and it all comes down to what does your audience already understand? What context do they already have?
Yeah, and our work with the ANBUT there for the ABT is we often talk about the inner circle and the outer circle. The inner circle is that inner audience that understands you, gets you, knows what you're talking about. You can use shortcuts. You don't necessarily have to use the ANBUT there for the ABT in this respect because they're already on board. Then you have that larger audience, that larger outer circle, much larger, by the way, which really has no idea what you're talking about. So you've got to put it in the context of the story. To your point, that doctor that comes in and says, how are they doing? Tell me what their vital signs are and what does it mean? That it's up to that doctor to be able to put it into the context of a story so that you and the patient can understand what's going on. What we find happen is so many people think that inner circle is bigger than it actually is. It's quite a bit smaller. Yeah. And in fact, sometimes it's just you and that person sitting in the cubicle next to you that have been working on this with you. And then you are both asked to go in and make a presentation. And you're just assuming, the curse of the expert, that everybody's on board and gets what you're talking about when they're not. And then they get confused and they feel stupid and you lose them. This is where that data storytelling really comes into play, and especially the and but therefore. So let's move to that for a second here. How do you use the and but therefore in your data storytelling?
Yes, I think it's so important in my data storytelling. I use it as a way of just making all of those data metrics that I've got to communicate make sense. And in some cases, there'll be a bunch of data metrics that you have to communicate, but you'll realize when you try and put them into this narrative structure that they're part of different stories. And a big mistake I see people making in terms of data communication is when they try to tell too many stories at once because they want to include all of those data metrics. And it just gets really confusing to whoever's listening. So I think the and but therefore is a huge step in my data storytelling process because it's the framework that holds that story together, and it makes you think really, really carefully about, okay, what is the conflict here? What is going to make people sit up and listen to what I'm about to communicate in terms of what this means? So for me, it's a big step in my process.
Will you give us an example of how you've used the ABT to communicate a data story, to maybe help focus it, frame it, and then actually articulate it to your audience?
Yeah, I can give you a quick example of what the ABT looks like in terms of a data story. So let's say you have done some analysis on customers, which is a very common thing to analyze in a business. And so an example of using the ABT and when you're communicating that particular analysis could be something like, last year, our organization had 20,000 customers and we held a large proportion of market share. But this year, our customer numbers have dropped by 25% because our competitors have increased their activity. Therefore, we need to think of ways to try and win back our customers or to regain that market share. And so that's a really quick example of how you would do a brief ABT. For me, sometimes this is not enough. Sometimes you need to flesh out that high level data story that you've written. And in that case, then you can go, I use the ABT as a starting point to go deeper. And so every statement in that ABT, so for example, last year we had 20,000 customers. If you wanted to go a little bit deeper there, you could explain the makeup of those customers, what they look like, their segments, if your audience required that information. So I use the ABT as a starting block. And sometimes it's fine to keep it really simple, whereas other times the audiences require you to put a little bit more data detail in there so that they have a fuller understanding of it. But it all depends on what your audience need.
Mm-hmm. So it's something like, and I'm going to use a customer of mine, Converter. This is the group out of London, and they have a sales enablement dashboard. It's a tech stack that brings together all this unwieldy stuff when you are running a campaign to then trying to organize all the leads you get from it. A lot of times companies, even very large advanced companies, are still stuck using spreadsheets, Excel spreadsheets, to try to cull through the leads, figure out which ones are good, which ones are bad. And the whole goal is to get the most prime prospect to their sales team as fast as possible so that they can get to them as quickly as possible for speed to closing a sale. All right. So they are nothing but numbers, names and numbers, and you don't even know if those leads are worth it. So it might be something like, I'm just completely winging this, but from the client's standpoint, I might say you just ran a $100,000 very dynamic campaign and attracted in 75,000 leads. And if you can get those most prime prospects to your sales team as quickly as possible, then they will close 50% more to accelerate your revenue. There's your and statement of agreement. Threw in some numbers, which I don't normally do, but I'm just playing with this. But they're not closing at the rate you hope for because 40% of those leads are absolute garbage and you don't know which ones they are. Mucking up your system, slowing down your revenue growth. Therefore, what if you could turn that or increase the pace by 3 times and provide your sales team with the ideal prospect when you use Converter, proven to accelerate sales by X% over, the course of time or whatever. So bringing in lots of numbers, saying, here's what you ultimately want. The numbers are one thing, but what you ultimately want is that speed to lead and that pace to closing deals. But it's not happening because a percentage of those leads, a good portion, almost 50%, are absolute garbage. Wasting your time, frustrating your sales team. Therefore, take out the garbage with Converter, and we can get you there in X percentage faster.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Now that's more of a marketing spin, but that's kind of a data story, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it has a very clear idea of what you're supposed to do, right? And it's easy, I think, if you're trying to use storytelling as a way of influencing an action, because there's a very clear call to action if you know what that action is, which makes that kind of storytelling in a marketing context very, very clear cut in terms of, yes, this is going to work, and it absolutely does.
No.
Whereas data storytelling, probably in most cases, there's not always an action in terms of go and do this. It's more sometimes you need to understand this, and it's using data storytelling as a way to increase somebody's knowledge around a topic rather than necessarily influencing what they do next. Because a lot of the time people need to have a certain level of knowledge on a particular piece of data or a topic before they will act. And in some cases, that's multiple data stories. So increasing their knowledge, educating them before they will get to a point where they feel comfortable to be able to make a decision around whatever it is.
Yeah. My favorite line when it comes to data storytelling, and in fact, I used it last week in Atlanta working with a financial company out there when, of course, they're nothing but locked into numbers. And I'm like, we want to get out of you've got the data, it's important, but you want to get to that outcome, or like you say in your book, the insights that data shares. So I always ask the question, and I'll ask it of you, Kat, and my ongoing listeners already know the answer. But when you're thinking about data storytelling and you default back to always, first leading with the numbers, ask yourself this question. What is the first syllable of the word numbers?
Num.
Mm-hmm. They mean nothing to us, really, unless we place them in the context of a story.
Yes, that's very, very true. And even if you are a self-proclaimed number person, I think it still applies. We can get very, very numb to receiving a whole lot of different data metrics all at once. And business, there are so many different data metrics, and you get exactly that. You get numb to it.
Have you heard of Edward Tufte, the famous American data visual? I'm sure, because he's kind of like the grandfather of data visualization, isn't he?
Yes, everybody working in data viz knows who he is.
His books are beautiful, and I've got 3 of them just because I was fascinated with how he told stories using data visualization. But I'll tell you, I went to one of his conferences, and I heard him speak for an hour and a half on data visualization, and I actually left early because he used no storytelling whatsoever. And I was kind of surprised because I thought, here's a guy that thinks in story. He must, if he's able to tell these stories with the amazing graphics that he puts in his books. But he was not a good data storyteller in person. And I was sort of shocked at that.
Well, I think the two, they're not one and the same, so they don't have to go together. The skills required for data storytelling are not the same skills that are required for data visualization. And you can be a really, really good data visualizer without having to ever need to tell a story. So not all data visualizations tell stories, and that's okay. When you think about the data visualizations that go into dashboards, they don't tell stories. They just make that data accessible in a way that's easy for people to look at and understand. Those people with the background knowledge of that data metric to be able to understand it. But data storytelling, I think, data viz is kind of this skill that a lot of people think that data storytellers need, whereas I don't think that's the case. I think you can be a really good data storyteller without ever needing to look at design knowledge or having that skill set or that background. And I think data storytelling, the main skill is to understand communication, because that's essentially at the end of the day what it is. You're just communicating data rather than something else.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, my whole career has been in the advertising world, and I'm a writer, storyteller by trade, not a designer. Luckily, I worked around lots of great designers and great creative director and learned a lot from them about the power of design or whatever, but I would not be a great data visualization storyteller because I'm just not, I don't have the design chops. I think you need to really pull that off. But I can certainly go out and share a story in written form and even my own little crude design way. So I agree with you that you don't have to be great at one to be great at the other.
Yeah.
Well, this is awesome. Thanks, Kat, for coming here. Where can people learn more about your great book, the Data Storytellers Handbook, How to Create Business Impact Using Data Storytelling?
Yeah, so it is available on Amazon, or you can order it from your bookshop if you prefer to go that route. I have my website. It's roguepenguin.co.nz, and so you can find out more about the book there. And
I'm glad you mentioned that because I meant to ask you earlier, where did the name Rogue Penguin come from?
I get asked this a lot. And so when I was coming up with it,
which is a good thing.
Yeah, it's different, right? I was trying to come up with a name for my business when I set it up. And at the time, there were lots of other companies who had data in the name, and they all sounded quite boring. So I wanted to be a little bit different. I wanted to stand out. And so at the time, I was trying to brainstorm all these ideas and coming up with just different words and whether they work together. But it all came down to, I was reading my daughter a story before bed. She was 5 at the time, and her favorite book was a book called Penguin, and the word just stuck. And rogue was one of those words that just held a little bit of emotional meaning for me. I wanted to go out and do things differently in terms of what I was doing. I didn't want to repeat more of the same that was already being done. And so rogue was one of those words that resonated with me. So Rogue Penguin, at the end of the day, came to light.
And that's where people can find you, roguepenguin.com?
.co.nz.
Yes, that's it. All right. Well, Kat, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. And folks, if you are dealing with numbers out there and you have the enviable job of trying to communicate the insights that are being born from your data, then get her book because it's so well written. It's fun to read through. There are fantastic graphics, great worksheets in there, and it's going to help you turn your data into drama, as I like to say. Kat, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Do you know anyone who would benefit by listening to this episode? If so, then by all means, please share it with them. Have you had a chance to leave a rating and review for us on iTunes to help others find our show? Well, if not, then you'd be doing me a huge favor if you do. Have you considered bringing me in to help you and your team excel through the stories you tell with the Business of Story Mastery course or keynote? If so, then please shoot me a note right now to park@businessofstory.com. I would love to help. Our show is produced and edited by Caden Howell, music composed by Darius Holbert, and community development and marketing by Marissa Hill. One last thing. Are you experiencing a ton of chaos in your business? I mean, who doesn't, right? Well, we are going to help you solve it next week with Clayton Mask, co-founder of CRM and operation management SaaS platform Keep, and author of his new book, Conquer the Chaos, The 6 Keys to Success for Entrepreneurs. One way to start conquering your chaos right now is to remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make that one, well, unchaotic. Thanks for listening.